Marcellus Williams, Carlos DeLuna, and Walter McMillan. All three of these men were on death row, and all three were innocent, Walter being the only one left alive due to his somewhat recent exoneration in 1993. All three of these cases were put out into mainstream media and were framed in different lights, showing that either these men were extremely innocent or extremely guilty. As most of you may know, capital punishment, also known as the death penalty, has been seen as a controversial topic for hundreds of years. There is plenty of evidence that can prove the fact that non-white perpetrators are more likely to be sentenced to death and convicted of the death penalty. There's a substantial overrepresentation of blacks and Latinos who are convicted of capital punishment than is related to their national representation. Certain media tends to highlight violence committed by these minority groups and causes more stigmatization on the groups. When media shows white perpetrators on trial for capital punishment, they usually make it seem as though the perpetrator was misunderstood or was in opposition a victim. This, in turn, will affect the public's perception of the defendant's guilt. Certain media outlets align with political parties, racial stereotypes, and other forms of beliefs that can elicit bias towards these cases. Many times, it is seen that the media will highlight a violent and deviant act committed specifically by minority groups to influence public opinion on that particular group. This then causes the racial stereotypes and biases created to outweigh the true facts of a case. The media is known to have a huge impact on society's perception of the criminal justice system, so when the media frames these cases, it can affect the overall perception of the effectiveness of the system and crime rates. For this research project, I searched to reveal how the media frames non-white capital punishment cases. I focused on three specific cases: Marcellus Williams, Carlos DeLuna, and Walter McMillan, to portray these framing tactics and their outcomes. I was able to find more than 10 sources of each case that revealed a type of media framing, making the defendant seem guilty or innocent. I used the content analysis research method when looking at the sources used. I was able to look at the different media outlets and see a pattern ascribed to all three of the cases. Now, let's talk about the way the media frames defendants of color facing the death penalty. First, you may ask, what is media framing? Media framing is the way the media presents and structures news or information, influencing how the audience interprets and understands it. Basically, it's the angle or perspective from which a story is told. The idea is that the media doesn't just report events, but frames them in a particular context, using specific words, images, and narratives to shape public perception. Looking at the role of media framing in crime reports, how different types of news frames and racial identity affect viewers' perceptions of race, we can see the different types of media framing. The first of these types being the sympathetic frame. The sympathetic frame is used by the media when they intend for the public to perceive the perpetrator as innocent. They will shine light on their mental health history or show the perpetrator to not have any prior criminal records. The second being the scrutinizing frame. The scrutinizing frame is when the media tends to shine light on the most violent or exciting parts of the crime committed by minority groups, which in turn causes more stigmatization of these groups, affecting the public's perception of the effectiveness of the system and the minority group's crime rates. Statistically, it has been proven that non-white perpetrators receive harsher penalties when on trial and more likely than their white counterparts to face the death penalty. Now moving on to the three cases. The first I'd like to discuss is the most recent case, Marcellus Williams. Marcellus, as we have learned throughout this class, was convicted of capital punishment for the violent murder of Leisha Gale. Leisha was stabbed 43 times in her home kitchen. There was no evidence linking Marcellus to the crime, only two witness statements who had profit incentives for reporting a name to authorities. Both of the witnesses had differences in their stories and received cash for saying Marcellus's name. Both have since passed away and were not able to take back their statements, although one, Marcellus's ex-girlfriend, tried to do so before her passing. Marcellus did not receive justice, and the media played a role in this. The scrutinizing framing of the Marcellus Williams case focused on reinforcing the legitimacy of the conviction and supporting the arguments that Williams was guilty. Some media outlets, particularly those supportive of the conviction, emphasized the strength of the original case against Williams, citing eyewitness testimony and the conviction's legal standing. They portrayed Williams as having been found guilty by a jury of his peers, which, in their view, should not be easily overturned. A scrutinizing media approach often included a focus on Williams' criminal background, which could be used to argue that he was a person capable of committing the crime. These outlets framed his past offenses as relevant to his character, implying that he might have been the type of individual who would commit such a heinous act. Some media outlets emphasized the importance of legal finality and the risk of reopening a case that had already been decided. This frame stressed that overturning the conviction based on new evidence would set a dangerous precedent, potentially undermining the credibility of the justice system and raising questions about the reliability of the courts and law enforcement. A scrutinizing approach would often center on the victim, Felicia Gale, and the grief and pain suffered by her family. Framing the case in this way could sometimes work to marginalize or downplay the new evidence and focus attention on the harm done to the victim's loved ones. This line of framing presented the case as one in which justice had already been served, and reopening the case could cause further pain to the victim's family. Some critics of the DNA evidence presented in 2017 cast doubt on its reliability. They questioned whether the DNA evidence truly proved Williams' innocence or whether it could be interpreted in different ways. This served as a way to minimize the significance of the new findings, implying that the original trial's conviction was sound. The sympathetic media framing when it came to Marcellus's case focused on the possibility of his innocence, highlighting the key details that raised doubts about his conviction. After Williams had been on death row for nearly 20 years, new DNA evidence came to light in 2017. The media covered the findings that DNA from the crime scene did not match Williams. This new evidence was crucial in shifting media attention toward the idea that Williams might have been wrongfully convicted. Media stories often pointed out the potential flaws in the prosecution's case, including claims that the original investigation had been mishandled and the prosecution might have withheld exculpatory evidence. Journalists framed the case as one of a flawed justice system, in which Williams, due to his race and the urgency to close the case, might have been wrongfully convicted. Some media coverage also humanized Williams, focusing on his personal story and the years he spent on death row. Stories often emphasized the emotional toll the case took on him and his family, showing the human side of the legal battle. The media also highlighted the growing support for Williams, including civil rights organizations, legal advocates, and even some members of the public. Activists who were critical of the death penalty used Williams' case as an example of how the system could wrongfully execute innocent people. This framing portrayed Williams as a victim of a deeply flawed system, aligning his case with a broader anti-death penalty reform narrative. Media framing played a crucial role in shaping public opinion around the Marcellus Williams case and impacted the legal process. The sympathetic framing, especially following the new DNA evidence, helped catalyze public interest in the case, leading to campaigns for his exoneration and ultimately to his sentence being commuted in 2017 by the Missouri Governor Eric Greitens. The scrutinizing framing, while less successful in preventing public doubt about the conviction, did maintain the perspective that the legal system must be upheld and that due process had been followed. This framing, often favored by prosecutors and law enforcement, persisted in the media as a reminder of the stakes involved in the case, that it was not just about one man, but about the integrity of the justice system itself. The media framing of Marcellus Williams' case shifted significantly over time, with the initial framing of his conviction and sentence focusing on scrutinizing his guilt, and later frames highlighting doubts about his innocence and flaws in the prosecution's case. The sympathetic framing played a central role in drawing attention to new evidence and spurring public and legal reconsideration of his conviction, while scrutinizing media frames emphasized the legitimacy of the original trial and the dangers of reopening a case that had been settled. Ultimately, the media's role in framing the case had a significant impact on the public perception and legal outcomes. Next, let's talk about the Carlos de Luna case. The Carlos de Luna case was where an innocent Latino man was wrongfully convicted and executed for the 1983 murder of a Corpus Christi, Texas, convenience store clerk. This case offers a significant example of media framing. De Luna was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death based on what later turned out to be a flawed case. His story has since been revisited many times throughout the years since his execution in 1989. The framing of De Luna's case in the media has played a critical role in the broader conversation about the criminal justice system, wrongful convictions, and the death penalty. Initially, when the case was covered in the media during the trial and in the years afterward, there was a focus on the eyewitness testimony that identified De Luna as the perpetrator. Scrutinizing media outlets defended the conviction, framing the case as one in which a reliable witness had identified the defendant, and this testimony was considered by the jury to be strong enough evidence for a conviction. Aligning with the early years after De Luna's conviction, media outlets were more likely to adopt a scrutinizing approach that emphasized the integrity of the judicial process. These outlets defended the conviction as the result of a fair trial and a just process, noting that De Luna's case had been reviewed by appellate courts and the jury had deliberated on the evidence before delivering its verdict. Some scrutinizing frames, particularly in the earlier years, pointed to De Luna's criminal history and behavior to suggest that he was the kind of individual capable of committing such a crime. His past offenses were sometimes used to justify the original conviction and to argue that his character made him a likely suspect. Scrutinizing media narratives often downplayed the possibility that Carlos Hernandez, the man who resembled De Luna and had a history of violent crime, was the real killer. Some journalists focused on the idea that Hernandez was an unlikely suspect and questioned the reliability of claims that he had been the true murderer, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. This framing contributed to efforts to uphold DeLuna's conviction even in the face of later challenges to it. In the years following DeLuna's execution, there was growing attention on the possibility that he was innocent. Investigative journalism, particularly the 2012 book, The Wrong Carlos, Anatomy of a Wrongful Execution, by James S. Liebman, brought to light significant doubts about DeLuna's guilt. The book argued that DeLuna was wrongfully convicted and pointed to evidence suggesting that another man, Carlos Hernandez, was the real perpetrator of the crime. Journalists and advocates sympathetic to DeLuna's case focused on the notion of a tragic miscarriage of justice. The wrongful conviction became a symbol of the flaws in the criminal justice system, especially the death penalty, which in this case resulted in the execution of an innocent man. Media coverage highlighted the personal tragedy of DeLuna's life as well as the profound social and moral consequences of the state's actions. Media outlets sympathetic to DeLuna often emphasized the inadequate legal defense he received during his trial. His defense attorney, who was reportedly underprepared, failed to explore alternative suspects or raise critical questions about the evidence. This sympathetic narrative portrayed DeLuna as a victim of systemic failures, including inadequate representation and investigative oversight. DeLuna's case became a humanizing story of a man caught in the gears of a flawed justice system. Sympathetic media often emphasized the hardships of DeLuna's life, his difficult upbringing, and the fact that he had been a product of systemic poverty and marginalization. In this framing, DeLuna was depicted not as a cold-blooded murderer, but as an individual who had been caught in a web of circumstances that led to his wrongful conviction and eventual execution. After his execution, various advocates for criminal justice reform, including the Innocence Project and others, rallied around DeLuna's case, calling attention to the serious flaws in the criminal justice system that led to his death. These efforts, covered sympathetically by media outlets, reinforced the narrative that DeLuna's death was part of a larger issue of wrongful convictions and the dangers of the death penalty. DeLuna's execution, as framed in sympathetic media, contributed to broader debates on the morality and efficacy of the death penalty. Journalists and commentators who sympathized with his case used it as an example of why the death penalty system should be reconsidered, pointing out that the innocent people could be and had been wrongfully executed. The sympathetic framing, particularly through investigative work and advocacy, has ultimately shaped public perception of the case as one of a tragic miscarriage of justice, making DeLuna a symbol in broader debates about wrongful convictions and the death penalty. Now, the case of Walter McMillian, an African-American man wrongfully convicted of the 1986 murder of a white woman named Rhonda Morrison in Monroeville, Alabama. This is another powerful example of how media framing can shape public perception and influence the legal process. McMillian was sentenced to death and spent 6 years on death row before new evidence emerged, proving his innocence. The media's framing of McMillian's case played a critical role in his exoneration and further advancements in the criminal justice system. Scrutinizing framing emerged, particularly in the initial coverage of the case and in some conservative outlets that were less inclined to acknowledge the systemic problems in the justice system. In the early stages of McMillian's case, some media outlets focused on the eyewitness testimony that had been used to convict him. They framed the case as one in which a jury had convicted McMillian based on the evidence available to them at the time, suggesting that the justice system had acted within its bounds. This framing sought to portray the conviction as the result of a fair trial, despite the later evidence of misconduct. Some media outlets skeptical of McMillian's exoneration framed the case as one that involved procedural errors rather than an outright miscarriage of justice. They suggested that the legal system had worked, but that some technicalities had led to a later correction, without acknowledging the systemic racial bias and prosecutorial misconduct that had been central to McMillian's case. Later in McMillian's case, sympathetic media coverage helped bring attention to the deep systemic issues in the criminal justice system, particularly in terms of racial bias and the abuse of prosecutorial power. Sympathetic media framing of McMillian's case centered on the complete lack of evidence tying him to the murder. The prosecution's case relied heavily on false eyewitness testimony and racial prejudice, rather than concrete evidence. The media highlighted how McMillian was wrongfully accused based on a fabricated story from a convicted felon, who later admitted his testimony was coerced. McMillian's case gained national attention largely due to the work of Bryan Stevenson, a civil rights attorney and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. The media framed Stevenson as a hero and McMillian as a victim of an unjust system, with the AI's tireless efforts to uncover the truth being central to the sympathetic narrative. The portrayal of Stevenson as someone fighting for justice and emphasized the larger social justice issues involved. McMillion's case was emblematic of racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. Sympathetic media frames highlighted how McMillion, an African-American man, was targeted by the police in a racially charged environment, where white juries were more likely to convict black defendants, especially for crimes against white victims. His case was portrayed as part of the larger racial injustice faced by black men in the criminal justice system, especially in the Deep South. Sympathetic framing often focused on McMillion's personal suffering, spending 6 years on death row for a crime he did not commit. Media outlets presented McMillion as a man who had been robbed of his dignity, his family, and his future due to an egregious miscarriage of justice. His emotional struggle, especially in the context of his family's hardships, became a powerful narrative in the media. As McMillion's story gained media attention, there was widespread public support for his exoneration. Sympathetic coverage highlighted the outcry from the public, civil rights organizations, legal experts, and many of whom who rallied behind McMillion to demand justice and bring attention to the flaws in the legal process that led to his wrongful conviction. As I stated in the beginning of this video, I was able to see a pattern ascribed to all three of the cases through media outlets. All three of these defendants, Marcellus, Carlos, and Walter, had no strong evidence linking them to the crimes they were convicted of, only witness statements. All three defendants were portrayed in the media as violent, heartless monsters when the news of the crimes had just been released. However, as time went on, the media started to lean into a more sympathetic portrayal of the defendants.